So, Randy Minotaur joins us tonight from Rochester, New York, where she has been a working writer for nearly 40 years on topics ranging from deaths in the national parks to the psychology of social conflict to birding and nature guides. She covers it all. A best-selling author, she writes books for the Bird Finding and Best Easy Bird Guide series for Falcon Guides, Globe Pequot Press, and is the author of Backyard Birding and Butterfly Gardening for Lions Press. Her most recent book, The Complete Language of Birds, A Definitive and Illustrated History, which is the focus of tonight's talk, and I have a copy right here, is a marvelous and beautiful encyclopedia that uniquely brings together classic illustrations, natural science, bird information, folklore, and legends about 400 bird species around the world. In addition to authoring books, Randy writes for Birding Magazine, is a regional report editor for North American Birds, and served for 3 years as president of the Rochester Birding Association in New York State. She has also participated in migratory and breeding bird research projects for the Nature Conservancy and the New York State Breeding Bird Atlas. Randy and her photographer husband, Nick, have crisscrossed the country to research and shoot photos of their book for their books on birds, hiking, history, and America's national parks. To date, they have visited 364 out of the 433 designated national park sites, which have served as inspiration for many of Randy's books, including her 99th published book, which is slated to be released this fall, Death in Grand Teton National Park. This is her 9th volume in her popular nonfiction series about people who visit national parks and don't live through the experience. So, not the focus of tonight's talk, but a gripping series of books that she also has written. And before I pass things over to Randy, I wanted to mention that we do have signed copies of The Complete Language of Birds at the PEM shop while supplies last. So now, without further ado, I hope you will please join me in giving Randy Minotaur a very warm, if virtual, welcome. Thank you, Randy, for joining us. And I am going to exit screen left, and I'll look forward to joining you after your program.
Okay, Janie, thank you so much. What a wonderful introduction. You covered every aspect of my career. I really appreciate that. I'm going to take a moment here to share my screen so that we're all looking at the same stuff. Go. There we go. That look good, Corey?
Yep, looks perfect.
Right. Okay. Terrific. Well, I thank you so much for inviting me to present to this group. I want to share a little something with you. Here at the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester, New York, we have your mummy from the Peabody Essex Museum. We have a wonderful sarcophagus display there that my husband happened to work on, and a gorgeous sarcophagus. We needed a mummy, and you were nice enough to loan us yours on, I guess, permanent loan because it's been a long time. Although, what's long in the life of a mummy? So, just wanted to say we have that little bit of connection there for those of you who are interested in that kind of thing. So, and speaking of Egyptian lore, in the beginning, there was a goose. Are we moving? There we go. This goose, in fact, an Egyptian goose, and at the time, the only being in the universe. Egyptians called this Gengen Ware, or the Great Honker. And this goose carried and protected the egg that, when hatched, would produce all life on Earth. But another being actually laid this egg. Jeb, god of the earth, also known by the nickname Great Cackler. Whether or not Jeb was actually a goose himself is subject to interpretation, but when he evolved into a human form over the centuries, he often wore an Egyptian goose or another bird as part of his headdress. In this particular depiction of Jeb, I'm going to guess that's a lesser blackback gull. Now, Egypt's creation story includes a third being, Amun, Lord of the Thrones, who also liked to take the form of a goose, as you can see in this petroglyph. In fact, the legend says that Amun's goose cry of victory over his adversaries became the very first sound heard by the people of Earth. And to commemorate this, Amun is known as the Great Shrieker. So, Jeb laid a golden egg that contained the sun. Gengenware incubated and hatched the egg that brought all other beings into existence. And Amun's goose presence scared off all the early adversaries. The result was, well, let there be light. Who knew that a goose could be so powerful? Now, down at the southern tip of Africa, a whole other creation was going on. The indigenous Khoisan people tell the story of their creator, a god called Swegob, who ignited a great fire to bring all of the traits of the animals out of the ether and into reality. So he gathered all of these traits and he baked them into all kinds of animal shapes, very like what we do with Christmas cookies. And as he did this, a Cory bustard, this very large bird with broad wings, served as his helper. The Cory bustard fanned the flames continually with its wings, keeping the fire burning until all of the animals were fully baked. And in a wonderful Aboriginal legend from Australia, all life began in the dark, skulking its way around the earth as best it could. And the spirits of the sky spent part of an eternity deciding how they would bring light into the world. So they built a huge pile of sticks that they planned to ignite, but they didn't want to frighten all the beings on the ground by suddenly producing this huge burst of light. Well, one day, an emu named Dinawan and a brolga named Bralach sat side by side on their nests, protecting their eggs in the dark. And as they talked about the children they would bring into the world soon, they began to argue about whose children would be stronger and whose would be more clever. So the discussion became more and more heated, and finally, Brolach grabbed one of Dinawan's eggs in her bill and used all of her fury to throw it as high as she could into the sky. And so high did it go that it collided with the huge pile of sticks collected by the spirits. The egg broke open, the yolk spilled over the sticks, and somehow this kindled them into a great bonfire. So the sky lit up, it bathed the earth in light, and it showed everyone just how beautiful Australia was. Well, from that day forward, the spirits decided that they would build a great fire every morning to light up the earth and let it burn until evening. But they still worried that the transition to light every day would frighten the animals. So they searched for one animal who could call to everyone each morning before they lit the fire to let them know that the light was on its way soon. And what animal did they choose? Well, if you've ever been to Australia, you know it's the laughing kookaburra, who is only too happy to volunteer to play this very important role. And to this day, this devoted bird wakes up an entire continent by calling just before sunrise. Now, after birds helped get the world up and running, they continued to play pivotal roles in the early days of the Earth. One of the big surprises for me in my research for my book was the sheer number of cultures around the world that record a great flood in their origin stories. Now, we all know the story of Noah and the ark, of course, and that as the waters began to recede once the 40-day flood stopped, Noah released first a raven and then a dove to see if they would find land. The raven never came back, suggesting perhaps it had found some nice waterlogged carrion to munch on and forgot all about the ark. But the dove felt more of a duty to Noah for saving its life, so it brought back an olive leaf, and that meant that the land had begun to emerge from the water. Well, other cultures tell this story a little bit differently. In some areas of the United States, Christians associate the painted bunting with the rainbow that God sent to Noah as a sign of his covenant with the earth. Painted buntings, then, are the living embodiment of the rainbow, reminding us that God protects us and will not destroy his creation again. Well, in the Birachek area of Turkey, people believe that Noah actually released a northern bald ibis from the ark, a bird they see as a symbol of fertility to guide the repopulation of the earth. Makes sense, right? Now, the Athabascans of Alaska believe that the Great Flood came to an end with the help of the American bittern. The bittern swallowed enough enormous amounts of water, flew to where more water would do the most good, and then regurgitated this water to form new rivers, like these gorgeous braided rivers that you find in Alaska. Now, an Ojibwa legend tells us that long ago, when the Creator sent the great flood to purify the world and drown everything evil, one man, Wayne Abuju, worked quickly and built himself a raft and managed to keep himself and just a few animals afloat for an entire month as they waited for the water to recede. But the water didn't go down. So he summoned several different birds to dive to the bottom and retrieve some dirt from the old world where he would use to start a new continent. Well, the loon was the logical savior, but he tried, and for some reason he failed. So the dove volunteered, and as you can imagine, that didn't go very well, and the poor thing nearly drowned. So finally, a lone coot took on the challenge, but he didn't tell anyone what he intended. And time passed before the other birds even noticed he was gone, and they started to search for him. They found him floating behind the raft, unconscious, but still breathing. Sure enough, when they started to resuscitate him, they found a little bit of mud from the bottom of the floodwater stuck to his bill. The coot had saved them, and Wayne Abuju could restart the continent. Now, it's worth noting that many other Native American legends of the Great Flood tell the same story, but with a different waterfowl as the hero. In the Algonquin culture, for example, it's a merganser who brings up the morsel of earth. It uses its strong feet to push off from the raft and drive itself downward, and then that sharp red bill to grab some earth and bring it back. Now, according to a Maori legend from New Zealand, the god Tawaki, who makes lightning and thunder, caused the flood when he created a crystal floor for heaven. The crystal floor caused all the water in the sky to fall in one place on Fjordland, where the Fjordland penguin lives. So this area received some of the most torrential rain in New England, and it still does. So the Fjordland penguins have been credited with actually making this rain fall and perhaps assisting Tawaki in creating the Great Flood. And in the jungles of Panama, the Great Flood serves as an origin story for the Great Tinamu. It seems that after the flood covered the world in water, the sun returned and a rainbow appeared, and the Great Tinamu, which is a dun-colored bird that blends right in with the surrounding foliage, saw that rainbow, and the intense color frightened it. So it flew away from all of the other animals and retreated into the murkiest part of the forest, where it lives to this day, shunning color in favor of darkness. So these are just a few of the flood-related stories I found in which birds play a starring role, but these amazing birds have many more legends to teach us throughout the world's folklore and mythology. Now, before I started work on the complete language of birds, I really had never thought much about what birds must have represented to ancient civilizations. We take so much knowledge for granted now, but there was once a time when people knew very little science about birds' habits and behaviors. So when they looked at the world around them and all the things they couldn't explain, they filled in some of the gaps with birds and their amazing abilities. So here's one of my favorite examples of this. Before science understood what we do now about migration and how it happens, it seemed to many observers that birds just disappeared in the fall and reemerged in the spring from whatever hiding places they'd used over the winter. So, one of the most bizarre theories about this involves the barnacle goose, a European species not unlike our own Canada goose. And oddly enough, there's one swimming about 40 miles from me right now that everybody's running to see in my area. So theorists back in the 500 AD area saw barnacles along wharves and docks and on the bottoms of the boats, and they guessed that these geese transformed into barnacles for the winter, sucked themselves down into these little things, and adhered to surfaces to wait out the frigid weather. And in the spring, the warmer weather gave them the cue they needed to change back. Now, back in 350 BC, the learned Greek philosopher Aristotle, for God's sake, theorized that swallows, with their ability to dive so close to the surface of lakes and ponds, actually dove to the bottom in the fall and burrowed into the mud there to wait out the winter. The whole oxygen thing apparently hadn't really taken hold in 350 BC. So this theory actually held on until the late 1700s, when sailors returning to Europe from warmer climates at the end of the winter reported seeing huge flocks of swallows in Africa, and they managed to put two and two together for the first time. And then, 100 years later, in 1822, German villagers shot down a white stork, this specific white stork, this one here that's in a museum in Germany. The bird had a wooden spear piercing its neck, and the spear's unusual wood could only have come from Africa. So, in a flash of insight, the German hunters realized that this bird must have migrated all the way to another continent and all the way back. So a single white stork finally changed the way ornithologists understood migration. That being said, so much of what people around the world attribute to birds has nothing at all to do with science. Wondrous parrots, like the imperial Amazon, the national bird of the Commonwealth of Dominica, and the African gray parrot, very popular now in the pet trade, are believed to have the ability to communicate with the spiritual realm. Not only can they fly high enough to reach the gods in the clouds, but they can actually form words. So you may need to watch what you say around one, or you may tattle to the ruling spirits, or worse, to your deceased relatives, and think what you're going to encounter when you get up to heaven. Now, one of our favorite North American birds, the anhinga, has represented different things to different cultures. We know the bird's classic stance, holding its wings out from its sides to dry after diving for its fish dinner. But some Christians see this as a symbol of the crucifix, making the anhinga a perpetual reminder of the passion of Christ, and therefore selfless, forgiving, and holy. On the other hand, the indigenous Tupi people of Brazil actually gave the anhinga its name, which means devil bird in their language. They determined that the anhinga is a trickster and a troublemaker because the bird swims with its body submerged and only its head out of the water like a snake. Such a creature's got to be hiding something, right? Can't be up to anything good. Now, here's another one of my favorites. Two categories of birds, magpies and mynas, that require us to be especially respectful when we see them, asking after their health or their family's welfare. If we treat them with disdain, or worse, ignore them altogether, we may meet a particular fate based on how many of the birds we see together. There's even a nursery rhyme to make this clear. One for sorrow, two for joy, three for a girl, four for a boy, five for silver, six for gold, 7 for a secret never to be told. So whenever you see a myna or a magpie, be sure to greet it warmly. Good afternoon, sir or miss. How are you today? Is your family well? If you're with a group and you don't want to look like a lunatic, just smile and nod or bow slightly. I'm told that the bird will understand. You had to see me in Hawaii a couple of years ago, where myna is essentially the starling of the islands. And they're everywhere, and every time I saw one, I was nodding and smiling. I must have looked like a lunatic. Now, one of my favorite stories involves the common kingfisher, a gorgeous bright blue bird of the rivers and lakes of Europe, Southeast Asia, and parts of the Asian continent, and obviously a relative of our own belted kingfisher. This is the tragic tale of Ceyx and Alcyone, two lovers in the days when Greek culture involved many gods living on Mount Olympus. Ceyx and Alcyone were soulmates, but equally important at the time, they were particularly well matched in physical beauty. So this made the couple very popular with the gods, who observed their romance with great interest, much as we might watch The Bachelor. The pair married and they began a life together, and they were so happy that, like most married couples, they gave each other little nicknames. Unfortunately, they chose to call one another Zeus and Hera, the names of the two gods at the very top of the Greek pantheon. Well, instead of Zeus being flattered, this made him very angry because Zeus is kind of a jerk. So one day, when Ceyx boarded a ship to Ionia, Zeus kicked up a storm, and his wrath created a massive wave that swallowed up the ship. Ceyx drowned, and his body sank to the bottom of the sea. Hera, however, knew how devastated Alcyone would be if she never knew for certain what had happened to Ceyx. As she watched the young woman wait and weep by the shore, Hera caused Ceyx's body to wash up near where Alcyone waited for word of him, and Alcyone, anguished by her loss, threw herself into the sea and drowned. Well, now Zeus felt remorse for the revenge he had enacted, so he resurrected both of them from the dead and turned the two lovers into halcyon birds, named for Alcyone. Today we know them as common kingfishers, and every summer, for 2 weeks, the winds grow calm so kingfishers can nest on the beach and bring a brood into the world. We call these the halcyon days, a period of calm and happiness, and Alcyone remains part of the taxonomic name for several of the world's kingfishers. Now, have you ever wondered how goldfinches got their bright yellow color? The Iroquois people did, and the story's been passed down for many, many generations. It seems that a fox chased a raccoon to make the little bandit its dinner. The raccoon ran up a tree, so the hungry fox waited all day at the bottom. But the raccoon, being no fool, didn't come down. Eventually, the fox dozed off, and when he awoke, he found that the raccoon was gone, but before it left, it painted the fox's eyes shut with tree resin. The resin had hardened and wouldn't come off, and the fox was essentially blind. So the fox called and called for help, and some drab little finches in the neighborhood took pity on the crying fox. So they flew in and they pecked off the resin. Before I leave this slide, I want to point out that you can tell that this was made by AI because the raccoon has two tails. So the fox thanked the goldfinches for the good deed by using some yellow flowers nearby to color their plumage bright yellow, the color of sunshine. And I picked Canada goldenrod for this because where the Iroquois are, which was in my neighborhood essentially, this is a native plant and might have been something that the fox chose to paint the goldfinches with. And the goldfinches wear this plumage all spring and summer to this day. So we have the fox to thank. Now, the story of the trapped fox and the helpful bird is one of the tales that shows up in the folklore of many different cultures, where it can be used to explain hummingbirds' iridescence or the bright colors of the northern cardinal. We can imagine people of many different tribes coming together thousands of years ago in meeting places like Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, Wupatki in Arizona, or the place pictured here, what we now know as Aztec Ruins National Monument in New Mexico. Here they traded goods and they would tell stories in kivas or in the shadows of ceremonial mounds. And one tribe might have an explanation for a specific thing that the others hadn't explored yet. So these stories would spread and become part of different cultures. So that's part of the reason that we hear so many of the similar stories from really very far-flung indigenous people. Now let's turn now to some of the bravest and some of the most superstitious people on the planet, those who ply their trade on ships at sea. Now, entire books have been written about the omens and portents brought by pelagic birds over boats filled with sailors, fishermen, or explorers. I know this because I had to find just about all of these books when I was working on my book. Seafarers especially revere the albatross. Any of the 22 species of these magnificent birds, including this Laysan albatross that we were fortunate enough to see and photograph in Hawaii last year. Well, for centuries, having an albatross around your neck has been synonymous with carrying a weighty burden that we can't wait to get rid of as soon as we can. This expression comes from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which I will not recite for you today, in which we learn that killing an albatross is the worst luck of all bad luck, inviting shipwreck and certain death. So, how do we counteract this bad omen? The person who killed the bird has to wear it on a rope around his neck, literally carrying the burden of the misdeed. An albatross can weigh as much as 18 pounds, so this penance is nothing to take lightly. Now, albatross lore on the high seas can govern the lives of sailors with endless speculation of whether an albatross following a ship is a good omen with a promise of protection or a bad omen of an oncoming storm with the bird hiding behind the ship to avoid the worst of it. Whichever it turns out to be, though, there's another twist. The albatross most likely carries the soul of a sailor lost at sea. So whether it's good news or bad news, the bird's protection or its warning are all meant with the best of intentions. So Coleridge's poem dominates seabird lore, but so it may seem that albatrosses are the only birds that affect a sailor's fortune, but far from it. The family of northern storm petrels also carry considerable weight with seafarers. The storm part of the name comes from their habit of taking refuge from an oncoming gale by following closely behind a ship, letting the large structure block the worst of the weather. So sailors took this as a dependable warning that a storm was on its way, but some thought that the birds actually brought the stormy weather with them, making a flock of storm petrels at a ship's stern a very worrisome sight. In fact, some seafarers went so far as to call it good luck if a storm petrel happened to defecate on them as it passed over them. This is a good time to remind you of the first rule of birding: never look up with your mouth open. Now, killing a storm petrel, even in retaliation for the defecation, was and is still considered bad luck, as if the shooter wishes to invite bad weather for a very long stay. So if you want to find yourself caught at sea in the middle of a hurricane, all you got to do is shoot down a storm petrel. And as long as we're on the subject of disgusting things people do at sea, fishermen of old observed gray herons, the European equivalent of our great blue heron, standing patiently, waiting for fish to swim by at just the right distance. And they decided that something about the heron's feet must attract the fish. So they carried a heron's foot to improve their luck. And some coated their fishing lines with a disgusting goo they made from heron's fat and feet. As this practice has faded, we can assume that it was not particularly effective. I also learned some fairly dark things about birds' lives, and I made a point of including these in the book as well because readers need to know that some of the world's birds face challenges from people with very selfish ends. The parrots of the Caribbean islands, for example, have been poached nearly to death for the black market on pet birds. Some of the islands have moved to name these birds as their national symbols, which has released funds and organized efforts to save them. But on some of these islands, it's virtually impossible to see the parrots that were once abundant there. You need special permission to go into wildlife refuges that have highly elevated levels of protection. And then we have the fate of the ortolan, a tiny bird that has had the bad luck of becoming a delicacy in parts of Europe. The recipe is gruesome. They fatten the bird up for more than 3 weeks in a cage. Then they actually kill it by drowning it in Armagnac brandy. The chef then cooks it, apparently dips it and deep fries it, and serves it whole, and the gourmands who eat the ortolan pop it down in one bite. But first, they toss a napkin over their faces so they won't be seen stuffing their mouths with this little morsel. Is that an admission of guilt or what? Only the bill remains on the plate when they're finished. I'm glad to report that the European Union has banned this practice, but there are still shady corners of Europe where the name ortolan makes mouths water. Finally, let's talk about some birds that don't exist. As we've seen, long before we began to understand birds in scientific terms, miraculous flying creatures became part of nearly every culture's mythology. Sometimes, though, the powers of actual living birds just didn't rise to the level the gods and storytellers required. Birds needed to do something more. Meld with the body of a god or goddess, for example, or become the lead character in a myth so vivid that it needs a supernatural species to tell it. In Egypt, the god Tot takes on the mantle of a bird, specifically an African sacred ibis, while he controls the passage of time and the change of seasons. Tot is the god of the moon, wisdom, writing, hieroglyphics, science, magic, and art. So he's a busy guy. And the ibis head allows him to change the pace of the passage of time so that he can get all of his work done. This only works for Tot. Don't try it at home. On the flip side of this benevolence, a mythical bird called an uzlum provides an excuse for any kind of foolishness, shifting the blame for mistakes away from the humans who made them and onto a bird just too silly to behave itself. In British and Australian legend, uzlum flies in a spiral of tighter and tighter circles until it eventually flies up its own butt. I'm guessing that everybody listening knows an uzlum or two in some form. Now here is the feng huang, or Chinese phoenix, one of China's 12 ornaments, ancient symbols that denoted the power and authority of the wearer. The ornaments date back to at least 2294 BC, and maybe much earlier than that. And they were embroidered on the clothing of high-ranking people in Chinese society. So the description of this beast has changed over the millennia, but this one follows more or less the more recent depictions. A golden pheasant's head, a mandarin duck's body, a peacock's tail, a crane's legs, and a parrot's bill. Wherever the feng huang appears, it implies the virtue and honesty of the people it adorns, and it often appears at weddings as a blessing of fidelity and harmony. And some households bring it out to display in good times and hide it away when times turn tough. Now, exactly how and where we acquired the legend of the phoenix has been a subject of debate for thousands of years. But it appears long before Greek mythology cemented the story of an immortal bird who eventually tired of its cushy life in paradise. Phoenix traveled to the mortal world where things lived and died, but the bird knew that he would remain immortal regardless. So one night, Phoenix built a nest of twigs, and as he waited for Apollo, the sun god, to arrive, he began to sing. Morning came, and Apollo passed over in his golden chariot. But the sun god so admired Phoenix's song that he actually stopped in midair to listen, and the sun stood still. A spark from the sun dropped down onto Phoenix's nest of twigs. The nest ignited, and Phoenix burst into flames and dissolved into ashes. Well, as we know, all was not lost for Phoenix. 3 days later, the magical bird sprang up from the ashes, young and renewed. But the bird realized that he could do this again and again, but that he would have to wait 1,000 years before his next renewal. So he continues to repeat this cycle of death and rebirth as he will for eternity. So, that's the complete language of birds, with stories about nearly 400 species of birds around the world. It's illustrated rather than photographic. Most of our books, of course, as Janie was nice enough to mention, contain my husband's gorgeous bird photography. But this one, the publisher really wanted it to be illustrated with vintage illustrations from the 18th and 19th centuries. So that's what it is. This was just an utterly delightful book to work on and to write, combining my love of birds, natural science, and history. And I hope it's as much fun for you to read as it was for me to write. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you today and introduce you to all of this mythology. And I will be happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Randy.
Well, that was
Re-
fun.
It's an incredible spectrum of bird life that you shared, um, from the spectacular to the grisly, which is fitting given that
Yes.
you're talking about legends across cultures and time. And um, so, as a reminder for folks, please put your questions either in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll be happy to share them with Randy, or you can just put up your virtual hand and Corey will take you off of mute so you can ask questions directly. That's totally fine. Um, I did want to circle back for a moment to the mummy because that caught my eye and my ear. I'm wondering if that was the Peabody Museum that's part of Harvard, because um,
Oh, yeah.
we get mixed up with them
Okay.
periodically.
Oh,
Um,
maybe it is. Oh,
yeah,
wow.
Yeah.
yeah. Because that would have been very surprising for us to be lending that, especially as a permanent loan from our collections. But so just wanted to bring that up.
Boy,
Um,
I will have to check. That's
yeah,
very, that is very interesting.
it's not uncommon for us to get calls from people looking for one of the three Peabody museums, of which,
Mhm.
yeah, we're the Peabody Essex, but then there's the Peabody Museum at Harvard, and there's the Peabody Museum in New Haven at Yale. So um,
Wow.
it's not surprising for people to, for them to get crossed up. But I would love to know, Randy, with this roughly 400 species of birds, how did you ever pick the ones that you included?
Mhm.
Well, funny story. I actually got this book project when another author had been working on it for several months and had made a list. And the and she backed out of the project. She said it was too hard.
Hmm.
So, and she wasn't somebody with a lot of background in birds. She was more of a botanist. So it probably was too hard.
Mhm.
But she had made a list, and the publisher decided they wanted to stick with pretty much with that list because they'd already started collecting illustrations. So um, so I kind of inherited that list, although there were things on it that honestly there just wasn't much of a story about. So I was able to make some substitutions as I went, and add the mythological birds as well. That was something they hadn't gotten into either. And so yeah, there are still other birds I wish were in this book, but tried to find the birds with the best stories at least.
Well, that you did, definitely. Yeah, and really fun to hear more detail. Because of course you can only include so much about any specific species in here, but you managed to do a wonderful blending of the attributes of the birds that may have also lent to the stories and the legends that they are
Yeah,
associated with as well.
right, right, exactly. So I see somebody just asked how I did the research. The internet is a wonderful thing, and I was able to find a great deal of what I needed in old documents, old books, and things like that that are available online. Thank God for the Wayback Machine and the Internet Archive, and things like that. But I am a huge fan of librarians. And we absolutely need libraries because there's
Yeah.
so much in libraries that is not available any other way. And one in particular in the Caribbean where somebody actually, a librarian scanned something handwritten for me
Hmm.
and sent it to me because there are still legends and folklore in the Caribbean that are not written down, that have not been published, that are still being passed around orally.
Wow.
So I was able to get some of that about some of the parrots down there. So there were a lot of different ways to get this information. And there were some birds about which I found nothing at all. That nobody's telling stories about them. Warblers in particular.
Mm-mm.
Strangely enough, that the yellow ones have significance to indigenous cultures because they represent sunlight and grain and the harvest. So when the yellow birds come back, it's time to plant. But beyond that, most warblers are not included in folklore and mythology, and I'd be really curious to try to figure out why that is. But
Mm.
maybe a lot of cultures just didn't see them long enough that they passed through too quickly.
There's a great question here that from Nancy Morgan. Are there animals other than birds that are found in folklore as much as birds?
Oh yes, foxes. Um, in particular foxes, wolves, chickens. Well, chickens are birds, of course, and
Bird.
I immediately go to the golden goose,
Mm,
or the goose that lays the golden egg. It's amazing how many cultures have that story. But birds, animals that are seen as either crafty or
mm,
have some other special attribute. Rabbits because they're swift, turtles because they're slow. um, you know, Animals that are seen as thoughtful. Bears in particular are huge in folklore and mythology. There's lots and lots of stories about bears. So yes, many things, and many of them also. If you then translate that to constellations, you start to see specific animals being repeated over and over, and bears again.
mm. But interesting, as a group, when you look at them as compared to perhaps the group of mammals, it's a great point that like there's so many legends and stories and like the origin myths that you were bringing up, the
Hmm.
blood myths of, uh, the birds coming to the rescue or bearing news. So it's a
You
good
know,
point.
the other one that just suddenly came to mind is an obvious one, coyote. Coyote is considered the creator in all sorts of indigenous cultures in the Western United States. So that, you hear stories about coyote all the time. So that's another one. But also an animal considered clever unless you watch Looney Tunes cartoons.
Mm. We have another question here. It says, "Do you have a favorite tale from the Baltic region of the world?"
Boy, um, Baltic. Boy, that's a honestly, nothing is coming immediately to mind, but maybe I don't understand Baltic specifically. Could you be more
Mhm.
specific about where you're thinking? Because I that what comes to mind to me then is Eastern European. Have I got that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay. There are quite a number of Slavic and Russian um,
Mm.
stories, um, particularly that there's a great deal about the golden goose or the goose that lays the golden eggs, or it's a duck. Um, but the golden egg thing is comes up in many different stories in that part of the world. Why that is, who knows? But people wandering around with, carrying their goose that lays the golden eggs from town to town and getting themselves either into trouble or that developing great riches because they're able to do favors for cultures by leaving them a golden egg. There's a lot of that in that area. As I was only researching birds, that's the one that came up quite a bit, but I'm sure there's tremendous folklore from that
Mm.
part of the world.
And then a question here about, are there stories about how birds are able to fly from Edward's Church?
Huh. Like how a bird got its wings, essentially. I did not come across that.
Oh,
The birds being able to fly, birds and insects were the only things that could, at least in human understanding, back then. So, because essentially the people were not around for the flying lizards, for the pterodactyl and things like that. But so I think that birds being able to fly was just considered a wonder. And it was not so much that they had to be taught or had to be gifted that, at least not that I came across, which doesn't mean that story isn't out there. But birds being able to fly is fairly taken for granted.
Right. And of course, for such a long time, bats were presumed to be birds
Right,
because they
bats.
could fly. So, I mean, it was ridiculous to think that there would be a flying mammal. So they were just confused birds,
Right.
essentially. Um, and uh, what's something that really surprised you, Randy? I know this was represented years of research, right? So, um,
I had 6 months to write this
oh, you
book,
had
so it's
six
oh my
months. Oh my
gosh,
gosh, that
months
must
of
have been
research.
6 months.
full on.
This was clear the decks, drop everything, do this. Yeah, so it came together much more quickly than it should have.
Well, that was full immersion then.
Yes.
Um, but was there something that you just had not expected that you would come across, but your research revealed to you?
Well, the whole thing that that's why I present sort of the timeline of migration. It just didn't occur to me that people didn't know that that's what was happening back
That was
Mhm.
then,
fascinating.
yeah, that um it was news to me that science doesn't go back thousands and thousands of years. It really barely goes back 200 years in some
Mhm.
cases. And then I've also done research on the history of medicine and found that an awful lot of that barely goes back 100 years. So um, the lack of science involved and the lack of understanding about how the natural world works was really a revelation of how recently we have come to understand those things. Um, Also, the sheer number of stories that I didn't talk about today, but that about beautiful women turning into birds and birds turning into beautiful women.
Yeah.
Just about every culture has got a couple of these. And they almost always involve a man capturing one of these birds or one of these
Mhm.
women and forcing her to remain a woman when she wants to be a bird. And, all this sort of control and abuse kind of overtones in that. That's something that was just creepy. But
Yeah,
it's out there. It's out there in a lot of cultures.
fascinating. Yes, that you were finding that as a recurring theme.
Yes. Yeah, it is funny what came up like, well, like the flood, that everybody's got a great
Hmm.
flood.
Right.
Yeah.
That photo, I mean, the photo of the stork with the spear or the
Yeah.
arrow. So it
Hmm.
survived. It had flown, and then it was obviously collected.
Yes.
Um, but that was a fascinating, like, oh, well, yes, it has to have come from that place
Mhm.
because that's where that wood comes from. It's awesome that that is still preserved for people to see.
It really is, that they understood how important a discovery that was. I mean, who but the Germans, the people who also created so much of our scientific history back then.
Language. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of inspiring that they figured out that that was important and that it changed the whole way we view bird migration.
Yeah, that's awesome. There's another question that came in. Did you ever come across tales that explained camouflage in birds?
There are stories about birds using that. But well, like the great Tinamu, that goes off and hide, decided to be dun colored and went off and hid. But how they became that, generally the stories are about how birds gained their brilliant colors rather
Mm.
than how they shed them to hide themselves in seasons where that's important. So yeah, not so much stories about how birds became camouflage, more how they shed their camouflage is more the story that I think appeals to people to tell.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Um,
Another family of birds that I would think would have been a lot in human mythology is owls. The
Oh, yes.
mysterious nature of owls. Did
Yes.
you come across a lot of stories in that regard?
Oh, yes. There are stories about owls being very wise. There are stories about owls being very sly. And there are stories about owls being stupid, which is interesting. But yes, owls have just a huge amount of mythology around them. Much of it has to do with their connection to the underworld. Because they can
Mhm.
fly silently and they look so
Yeah.
different from other birds. And then you've got the barn owl and that unearthly screech of it, that um, they become part of how, well, in particular, uh, owls. It's believed that if an owl flies over your house or is hanging around your house, somebody's about
Mhm.
to die, and the owl is waiting to take its spirit, that person's spirit, to the netherworld. So there is, they're a ghostly presence. They're a scary portent of bad
Mm.
things to come in a lot of mythologies.
I can imagine that.
Yeah.
mhm. And being nocturnal certainly didn't help them either
Yes.
on that front.
No, exactly. Exactly. Anything that goes bump in the night or doesn't in this case Yes.
or make hooting sounds in the night.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yes.
Right. Well, there are so many questions to ask you on this. But I feel like we've covered a good spectrum of them. Susan, was there anything else you wanted to ask?
No, I think that that was a fascinating talk about the book that I cannot believe you put together in 6 months.
Me either.
Oh my Well, I know you are a prolific writer, and that must have come in handy. Obviously, you're very good at research as well. Um, and I know there's you have a whole other dimension with the work that you do with the national parks in this, the storytelling around that and the ongoing quest to visit all the national parks. I
Yes.
assume that's still on your list to do that.
Yes. It's a very expensive hobby. Yes.
Good one.
But yeah, we're coming to the end of what we can see where we still need to go in the contiguous 48 states. And we've done Hawaii. So, and we've been to Alaska once, but we only saw two national parks when we were up there. So that was a long time ago. So we need to return there and figure out how we're going to get into northern Alaska to the places where there are no roads. So to
Mm.
get to Kobuk Valley and Bering Land Bridge and places like that. So yeah, it's
Ambitious.
an ongoing quest. We may or may not finish it. We'll see.
Well, it's a worthy one for sure.
Yes.
The
Yes.
adventure of that is worth it alone. And um, well, thank you so much, Randy. It's been such a treat to bring you here from Rochester. And
Oh, that,
uh, I hope
well,
that you'll come up and visit us in New England in this wonderful place of Salem and the North Shore is an incredible birding area.
yes, it is. Yeah. Oh,
So
I had the pleasure of spending time there when I was working on our book on birding in New England. So,
Oh, good.
yeah, when you said Plum Island and Parker River, oh my God. I would love to be there.
yeah, yeah, it's really special to have that here.
Yes.
Mm.
And well, thank you again, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. And I hope that you'll come to the next event on March 6th. That will be in person, but also with a virtual option. So lovely to be with you. And thank you, Susan, for joining as our new ECOC president. And lots of thanks coming in from people, Randy, for your talk. So really
All
great to
right.
have you.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you so much. This was really fun.
Wonderful. Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.
Thank you.